Deep underground, something was being extracted. The Sumerian texts don't ask you to believe this, they simply state it the way you might note that water flows downhill or that crops need sun. In the Atrahasis epic, pressed into clay around 1700 BCE, the words are specific. The Igigi gods carried tools, they dug channels, they excavated earth. For 3,600 years, the text says, they worked beneath the surface until their hands blistered and their backs refused the burden. Then they stopped, they threw down their tools, they burned their equipment, and the senior gods. The Anunnaki who had ordered this work faced a crisis that required an entirely new solution. What were they extracting? Why underground? And why does every major Sumerian creation account circle back to this same image? Divine beings labouring in deep places, exhausted beyond endurance, replaced by something else. Before we go further, leave a comment about where you're listening from. There's something about hearing these ancient accounts at night, wherever you are in the world, that makes the questions feel closer. The texts travelled far from the desert where they were written, so have you. The story doesn't begin with mining, it begins with the structure of the cosmos as the Sumerians understood it. 3 realms, heaven above, where Anu ruled, earth in the middle, where Enlil held dominion, and the deep waters below, the Abzu, where Enki made his dwelling. Not metaphorical waters, not symbolic depths. The texts describe the Abzu as a physical location, a place where fresh water originates, where certain gods reside, where work gets done, and in multiple independent tablets separated by centuries in geography, that's where the labour happened, before humanity, before cities, before the flood that would later divide all of time into before and after. In the beginning, according to these texts, there was work to be done in the places below the earth, and beings called to do it. This isn't ancient astronaut theory. This isn't about gold for a distant planet. This is about what the oldest written documents actually say when you read them carefully, when you track the Sumerian words themselves, when you follow the pattern that appears again and again in texts that had no reason to copy each other. Something was happening underground. The tablets remember it, and they remember it the same way across different cities, different time periods, different contexts, with a consistency that has troubled scholars for a century. The language that slept in sand. The city of Nippur sat empty for 2,000 years before anyone returned to ask what it had been. Wind-carved mounds of dirt, fragments of brick, the shape of walls barely visible beneath accumulated dust. In 1889, an expedition funded by the University of Pennsylvania arrived at these mounds in what was then Ottoman Iraq, led by a professor of Hebrew named John Punnett Peters. They didn't know what they would find. They suspected it would be significant. They had no idea it would rewrite the beginning of written history. The dig was brutal. Summer heat reached temperatures that made the work nearly unbearable. Equipment broke, workers fell ill, local tensions flared, but beneath the dust of Nippur they found rooms. And in those chambers, preserved by the dry climate and the accident of abandonment, thousands upon thousands of clay tablets covered in wedge-shaped marks, cuneiform. From the Latin cuneus, meaning wedge, the oldest form of writing known to exist, pressed into clay with reed styluses by scribes who lived when Egypt was young. The tablets from Nippur dated to different periods, some to 2500 BCE, some later, some fragmentary and impossible to date with certainty. But they represented something unprecedented, the written records of Sumer, the civilization that would give the world the wheel, the plough, the sailboat, mathematics, astronomy, law codes, and literature itself. Peters and his team shipped the tablets back to Philadelphia. 17,000 of them, eventually. Fragments, complete works, accounting records, hymns, myths, school exercises, medical texts, astronomical observations. The University of Pennsylvania Museum still houses the largest collection of Sumerian tablets outside Iraq. CBS Numbers, catalogue of the Babylonian section. Each tablet received a number. Each number represented a voice from the deepest past speaking in a language no one alive could read. That was the problem. The marks were clear. The tablets were intact. But the language was extinct, had been extinct for thousands of years, and unlike Egyptian hieroglyphs which were being deciphered around the same time, cuneiform represented multiple languages written in the same script: Akkadian, Babylonian, Assyrian, and beneath all of those, older than all of those, Sumerian. The decipherment took decades. It required finding bilingual texts, tablets where scribes had written the same content in both Sumerian and Akkadian. It required identifying repeated words, comparing contexts, building vocabulary lists. One painstaking entry at a time. Scholars like George Aaron Barton, Herman Hilprecht, and later Samuel Noah Kramer devoted their entire careers to making Sumerian speak again. And when the language finally yielded its meaning, when the text could be read, what emerged was not what anyone expected. Not exactly. Yes, there were administrative records as anticipated. Yes, there were religious hymns. Yes, there were king lists and building dedications and school lessons. But there were also narratives. Stories, myths, the scholars called, accounts of creation, of flood, of gods interacting with the world in ways that were specific, detailed, procedural. One of those accounts described how human beings came to exist, not in vague, poetic terms, in functional terms, as a solution to a labour problem, as a replacement workforce for gods who had been doing work themselves and could no longer bear it. The text is called the Atrahasis Epic, compiled in its surviving form around 1700 BCE, but drawing on earlier sources. Multiple tablets preserve different portions of it, allowing scholars to reconstruct the narrative even where individual tablets are damaged. The opening lines are direct. When the gods like men bore the work and suffered the toil of the gods was great, the work was heavy, the distress was much, not metaphorical toil. The text continues with specifics. The Igigi lesser gods in the Mesopotamian pantheon were assigned to dig. They excavated the beds of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. They cleared channels. They removed earth for 3,600 years, the text says. And then the gods were digging watercourses, canals they opened, the life of the land. The Igigi gods were digging watercourses, and they counted the years of toil. But not just surface work. The Atrahasis Epic uses the Akkadian term iru for the digging, a word that implies excavation, going down, removing what lies beneath. In one preserved section, the text describes the Igigi carrying tools into the depths and working there until their strength gave out. The word for depths, Euplu, appears in other Mesopotamian texts to indicate underground places, foundations, the lower regions of the cosmic structure. Samuel Noah Kramer, who spent 52 years translating Sumerian tablets at the University of Pennsylvania, noted the precision of these accounts. The texts don't speak in the vague language of myth as we understand it. They speak in the procedural language of record keeping. They note duration. They specify locations. They describe working conditions. They document a labour dispute and its resolution with the kind of administrative detail you might find in a foreman's log. This presents a problem for interpretation. If these are purely symbolic texts, allegories about the relationship between gods and humans, metaphors for civilization's development, why include such specific procedural information? Why mention the tool carrying? Why note the counting of years? Why describe the physical exhaustion in terms of blistered hands and backs bent from labour? Thorkild Jacobson, another giant of Mesopotamian studies, argued that these myths reflect Mesopotamian society, projecting their own agricultural struggles onto a cosmic screen. The gods dig canals because Mesopotamian civilization depended on canal irrigation. The gods grow weary because farmers grew weary. The creation of humans as workers reflects the social structure where most people laboured to support a smaller elite. This interpretation has been academic consensus for decades. It's reasonable. It accounts for the content in terms we understand: cultural projection, symbolic narrative, religious justification for social hierarchy. But it doesn't account for the underground element. Mesopotamian farmers didn't work underground. Canal digging happens at the surface. Irrigation is visible, public, done in daylight. Yet the texts consistently place the Igigi's labour in connection with the Abzu, the deep waters beneath the earth, and describe their work in terms of excavation that goes down, not just across. When the cuneiform was first being deciphered, scholars assumed these details were poetic embellishment, mythological flavour, ways of making stories more dramatic. But as more tablets were translated, as vocabulary became more precise, as the distinction between Sumerian words became clearer, the pattern remained: multiple texts, different time periods, various authors, all describing the same sequence: underground labour by divine beings, exhaustion beyond bearing, rebellion, creation of humanity as substitute workforce. The tablets came from different cities: Nippur, where Peters excavated; where Leonard Woolley would later uncover royal tombs; Eridu, the oldest city according to Sumerian tradition. Babylon, much later. The texts sometimes varied in details, different gods emphasized, different aspects highlighted, but the core narrative stayed consistent. Work underground. Divine workers, human creation as solution. This consistency troubled some scholars. In mythological traditions, stories typically diverge as they spread. Details change, names shift, emphasis evolves. But across Sumerian and Akkadian sources, across centuries and city-states that sometimes warred with each other, this particular narrative remained stable. The Igigi worked below. They couldn't continue. Humans replaced them. The University of Pennsylvania's collection includes fragments from multiple versions of creation accounts. CBS 10673, the Eridu Genesis, damaged but readable. CBS 2688, part of the Enki and Ninmar composition, describing the creation process itself. CBS 8383, the Barton cylinder, dating before 2500 BCE with the earliest Sumerian creation material. None of these tablets was found in the same location. None appears to have been copied from the others. Yet they share this element, work in the deep places, performed by beings before humanity existed. When you stand in the Near East galleries of the Penn Museum, you can see some of these tablets on display. They're small, unimpressive to eyes accustomed to grand monuments. Clay the colour of earth, marked with tiny wedges that need good light to distinguish. But those marks preserve something that has outlasted every empire since. A memory, a record, an account that doesn't ask whether you believe it, that simply documents what the Sumerians themselves believed had happened, or knew had happened. The distinction matters. Religious texts about gods often read like prayers, aspirations, hopes projected onto divine figures. These texts read like reports. This is what occurred. This is how long it lasted. This is what they were doing. This is why it changed. The language that slept in sand for 2 millennia woke speaking of underground operations, divine exhaustion, and the creation of humanity for a specific purpose. Not humanity as beloved creation. Not humanity as divine image. Humanity as workforce, as replacement labor, as the solution to a problem that had existed before cities, before agriculture, before the world took its current form. The academic response has been to contextualize this as social allegory. And perhaps that's correct. Perhaps these texts do nothing more than project Mesopotamian labor concerns onto a cosmic mythology, explaining why work is hard by saying even gods found it unbearable, justifying human toil by making it the purpose of human creation. But that reading requires ignoring the specificity, the underground element, the Abzu location, the excavation terminology, the consistency across independent sources. It requires treating detailed procedural information as poetic flourish rather than descriptive content. What if the texts mean what they say? Not metaphorically, not symbolically. What if the Sumerians preserved an account of something that actually happened, described it in the only terms they had, attributed it to the beings they called gods, because those beings had capabilities humans didn't possess? This is the question the tablets force, not the ancient astronaut answer that's too easy, too modern, too divorced from what the texts actually contain, but the question itself. Why this pattern? Why this consistency? Why these specific details about operations beneath the earth conducted by beings who preceded humanity, creating humanity to continue work they themselves could no longer sustain? The language slept. It woke, speaking of depths and digging, and that's where the investigation must begin. Before the flood, there were names. At the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, a clay prism sits in a controlled environment, roughly 20 centimetres tall, covered on all 4 sides with columns of cuneiform text. The Weld Blundell prism, catalogue number WB 1923 444. It was found at Larsa in modern-day Iraq during a 1922 expedition led by British archaeologist Herbert Weld Blundell, acquired by the museum the following year. Of all the surviving copies of the Sumerian king list, this is the most complete, the most legible, the most troubling to interpret. The king list is exactly what it sounds like, a chronological register of rulers, city by city, dynasty by dynasty, reaching back to the beginning of kingship itself. The text begins with a statement. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. Then it names kings. It lists their reign lengths. It notes when kingship moved from one city to another. It proceeds through history in orderly fashion, until it reaches rulers whose existence can be verified by other sources, whose building projects can be excavated, whose reign lengths match what independent records confirm. But that comes later. The beginning of the king list is different. Before the flood, the text explicitly divides history into before and after a great flood. The reigns are impossible. Not improbable, impossible. Alulim, first king of Eridu, is credited with ruling for 28,800 years. Alalanga, the second king, ruled for 36,000 years. The pattern continues through 8 kings in 5 cities, with reigns ranging from 18,600 to 43,200 years. The total duration of kingship before the flood, according to the Weld Blundell prism, 200 years. Then the flood. Then the flood swept over. After the flood had swept over, and the kingship had descended from heaven, the kingship was in Kish. The rulers, after the flood, still have extraordinary reign lengths at first. Gaur of Kish ruled for 1,000 years, his successor for 960 years, but the numbers gradually decrease, approaching what might be historically plausible by the time the list reaches the first dynasty of Ur, around 2600 BCE. Scholars have proposed numerous explanations for the pre-flood numbers. Sexagesimal calculation errors, where a base 60 numbering system produced inflated figures through scribal mistakes. Dynasties listed as sequential that actually overlapped, creating artificially extended timelines. Symbolic numbers meant to convey cosmic significance rather than historical duration. Mythological rulers representing collective memory of pre-civilizational periods. The conversion of month reigns or season reigns into year reigns through later misunderstanding. Thorkild Jacobson examined the king list extensively, noting that the post-flood section aligns increasingly well with archaeological evidence as it approaches historical periods. He concluded that the list represents an attempt to create continuous history reaching back to the beginning of time, with early portions filling a narrative gap using legendary or symbolic material. The pre-flood kings in this view aren't historical figures, but mythological constructs, giving structure to an otherwise unknown past. Samuel Noah Kramer agreed, suggesting the pre-flood section derives from earlier mythological traditions, perhaps oral histories, that were historicized by later scribes who wanted to connect their present to the deepest past. The flood serves as a division between mythological time and historical time, with the pre-flood world representing a different order of existence that the Sumerians themselves couldn't directly access. This interpretation is academically sound. It accounts for the impossible numbers. It acknowledges the mythological nature of pre-flood narratives. It recognizes that the king list's historical reliability increases as it approaches verifiable periods, suggesting the early material serves theological or ideological purposes rather than chronographic ones. But there's something the interpretation doesn't address. The names of the pre-flood kings appear in other texts. They're not inventions unique to the king list. They show up in separate mythological cycles, in incantations, in literary compositions that have nothing to do with establishing royal chronology. Ziusudra, the flood hero in the Sumerian tradition known as Atrahasis in Akkadian sources and corresponding to the biblical Noah, is listed as a pre-flood king in some versions of the king list. His story exists independently in the Eridu Genesis, where he's warned by Enki about the coming deluge and survives it by building a vessel. This suggests the pre-flood kings weren't simply invented to fill a chronological gap. They were figures from existing traditions, incorporated into the king list, because the Sumerians themselves believed these figures had preceded the flood. The impossible reign lengths might be errors, might be symbolic, might represent some measurement system we don't understand. But the names themselves carried weight. They belonged to a remembered time before the world took its current form, and in that time before the flood, according to multiple Sumerian texts, the structure of labour was different. The Atrahasis epic places its labour crisis in the pre-flood world, the rebellion of the Igigi gods, the creation of humanity, the initial period of human existence. All of this happens before the deluge. The Eridu Genesis similarly describes the creation of cities and the establishment of kingship, then the gods' decision to destroy humanity with a flood, then the survival and continuation. The flood is the dividing line between two different orders of existence. The king list doesn't explain why the flood came. Other texts do. In the Atrahasis epic, the flood is sent because humanity has become too numerous, too noisy, disturbing the gods' rest. In the Eridu Genesis, the reason is less clear. The relevant portion of the tablet is damaged, but the decision is made by the gods in council. In both accounts, one god, Enki, opposes the destruction and warns the flood hero, enabling survival. What's significant is the timing. The labor crisis, the creation of humanity, the impossible rain lengths, and the pre-flood world all belong together in the Sumerian chronology. Whatever was happening underground, whatever the Ijiji were doing in the Abzu before they could no longer sustain it, happened during the time when kings ruled for thousands of years, when the world operated under different principles, when the distance between gods and earth was smaller. After the flood, everything changed. Rain lengths began approaching normal human lifespans. Cities rebuilt according to new patterns. The Anunnaki became more distant, less directly involved in earthly operations. Humanity took on the full burden of civilizational maintenance, and the stories about what came before became myths, preserved, remembered, copied and recopied by scribes who believed they were documenting their heritage, but who no longer lived in the world those stories described. The Weld Blundell Prism sits in Oxford 3,800 years after it was inscribed, preserving names from a time even older. Aluli, Alalanga, Enmenluana, Enmengalan, names that resonated through Sumerian consciousness, attached to a period before the world as they knew it existed. A time of different labour structures, different relationships between divine and human, different operations in the places beneath the earth. If the pre-flood numbers are symbolic, what do they symbolize? If they're errors, why were the errors consistent across multiple copies of the king list found in different cities? If they're mythological, why attach them to specific named rulers who appear in other contexts? Or, and this is the question that sits at the edge of academic respectability, what if they're recording something real using a measurement system that doesn't translate into our calendar? Not literally tens of thousands of years, but something, some kind of duration, some kind of cycle, some kind of process that took time. The Sumerians could only express in numbers that seem impossible to us because we're reading them wrong. The king list doesn't exist to make scholars comfortable. It exists because the Sumerians believed kingship had a history, and that history reached back before the catastrophe that divided time. In that earlier time, things worked differently. Labour worked differently. The beings who ruled and the beings who worked and the relationship between them followed patterns that wouldn't survive the flood. And in that world, the world of impossible rains and gods who walked the earth and operations conducted in the deep places, humanity was created for a purpose. Not in some vague theological sense, in a specific functional sense, to do work, to replace workers, to continue operations that couldn't stop but that the previous workers could no longer sustain. The Weld Blundell Prism doesn't explain this. The king list simply notes who ruled and for how long, anchoring Sumerian history to a beginning point that vanishes into durations we can't quite comprehend. But the king list doesn't stand alone. It's one piece of a larger textual tradition, all pointing backward to the same place, a time before the flood when the structure of reality was different and something was happening underground that required endless labour by beings who preceded humanity. The names remain, pressed into clay, guarded in a museum. Speaking of a world that ended in water but began in depths, in excavation, in work that defined the age before everything changed, the rebellion in the deep. The tablets that preserve the Atrahasis epic don't agree on every detail. Some versions emphasize different gods, some expand certain episodes while condensing others. But every surviving copy includes the rebellion, the moment when the Ijiji, the lesser gods assigned to labour, stopped working, not gradually, not through negotiation, violently, absolutely, with fire. They set fire to their tools, fire to their spades they put, and flame to their work baskets. This is specific language. The Akkadian text uses words for actual equipment, alu spades or picks used for digging, tupliku, baskets for carrying excavated earth, narkabtu tools of some kind, possibly cutting implements. The Ijiji didn't abandon their tools. They didn't misplace them. They burned them in what the text describes as a coordinated action. Then they marched at night. The text is specific about this too. By night they came. They surrounded the house of Enlil, the god who had organized their labor. They didn't attack. They demonstrated. They encircled the residence of the chief god and stood there in the darkness, in the deliberate presentation of unified refusal. Enlil's response is fear. The text doesn't soften this. Enlil was afraid. He opened his mouth and said to Anu, his father, "They have surrounded my house. Let them attack me." He interprets the presence of the Igigi as prelude to violence. He calls for help from Anu, the sky god, the highest authority. Anu's response is to ask what every administrator asks when workers refuse. What is this? He summons the Igigi's overseer, a god named Nusku in some versions, to find out what grievance has caused this disruption. The overseer goes to the assembled Igigi and asks the question directly. The answer comes back clear. The toil is too much. The work is killing us. The distress is severe. The Akkadian preserves the precision of this complaint. Dalu toil, labor, worker's obligation. Cab 2, heavy, burdensome, crushing. Yubu, as continuous activity. Ma, to be worn out, exhausted beyond capacity to continue. This isn't poetic language about difficulty. This is administrative language about unsustainable working conditions. The kind of language that appears in later Mesopotamian legal texts when describing disputed labor arrangements. And the Igigi make their position absolute. Every god has joined the work. The distress is severe. The work is heavy. Every god, not some, not most, all of them. They're describing universal refusal, a complete work stoppage. The modern term would be general strike. The ancient reality was divine rebellion. Now Enlil faces a problem. The work needs to continue. Whatever was being extracted, whatever was being accomplished by this labour, it can't simply stop. But the workers have burned their tools and refuse to return. His response is telling. Let one god be slaughtered, so that all the gods may be cleansed. With his flesh and his blood, let Nintu mix clay. This is the creation of humanity, not as special creation, not as beloved offspring, as replacement workforce. The Akkadian term used is Aa-Pesel, worker, labourer, human being. The three concepts overlap in Mesopotamian thought because humanity's defining characteristic, in this tradition, is labour. Humans work. That's what humans are for. That's what distinguishes humans from gods. Gods rest. Humans work. Except in the time before humanity, gods had to work, and they couldn't bear it. The proposal is accepted. A god is chosen for slaughter. The text calls him Ilu, though the name varies in different versions. He's described as the one who had the plan, suggesting he may have been the rebellion's instigator. His slaughter is ritualized. Nintu, the birth goddess, takes his flesh and blood and mixes it with clay, the same clay from which the tablets themselves are made. She shapes forms. She creates humans. The text is explicit about the purpose. Let him bear the yoke. Let him carry the work of the gods. Let man take on the toil of gods. The creation isn't one human, it's a workforce. 14 humans initially, 7 male, 7 female, with the capacity to reproduce and multiply. The gods establish this as permanent solution. The Igigi are released from their labour. Humanity assumes it. And the tablets record that this satisfied everyone involved. The Igigi rejoiced. They proclaimed the name of Enlil. They named him the Lord of all the gods. The labour continues, but the labourers change. What's notable about the Atrahasis epic is what it doesn't say. It doesn't explain what the Igigi were doing. It references digging the rivers, presumably the Tigris and Euphrates, and it mentions their work in connection with the Abzu, the underground waters where Enki dwells, but it doesn't specify what material was being extracted, what resource was being processed, what product resulted from 3,600 years of divine labour. It simply notes the work was happening, that it was underground or connected to the depths, that it required tool use. The spades and baskets the Igigi burned were items the text's audience would recognise, implements for excavation and earth moving, that it was unsustainable for the original workers, and that humanity was created specifically to continue it. Later, Mesopotamian literature takes this for granted. The Epic of Gilgamesh, much later, refers to humans as the work of the gods. Temple hymns describe humanity as the the ones who bear the yoke. Administrative texts from Sumerian cities track labor obligations using terminology that echoes the divine labor vocabulary of the Atrahasis epic. The idea that humans exist to work, that work is humanity's defining purpose, permeates Mesopotamian thought, and it all traces back to this: the Igigi rebellion and the creation of substitute workers. Academic interpretation views this as social justification. Bronze Age. Mesopotamian society depended on massive labor forces for irrigation, construction, agriculture. The majority of people worked to support a smaller elite, creating a myth where even gods required workers. Where humanity was designed for labor, would naturally reinforce social hierarchy. It explains suffering. Work is hard because even gods found it too hard. It explains inequality. Some must work, so others may rest. Just as humans work, so gods may rest. This interpretation is persuasive until you examine what work the texts describe. Not agriculture, not visible construction, not surface irrigation. The Igigi's labor happens in connection with the Abzu, the deep underground realm. The spades and baskets suggest excavation, not farming. The exhaustion suggests sustained physical labor in difficult conditions. The rebellion suggests this wasn't cyclical agricultural work with seasonal variation, but continuous operation without relief. If this is agricultural allegory, why underground? Why continuous? Why do multiple independent texts place the critical labor? The labor so unbearable it required replacing the workers in the depths rather than in fields. The tablets from Nippur that preserve portions of the Atrahasis epic date to the Old Babylonian period, roughly 100 and 1600 BCE. But the story they tell is older. The language contains archaisms suggesting the narrative was already ancient when these copies were made. The same pattern appears in earlier Sumerian texts like Enki and Ninmah, which describes the actual creation process in more detail. The story wasn't invented in the second millennium, it was preserved from something earlier. And what it preserves is this: before humanity, there was extraction work happening underground. Divine beings performed this work until they couldn't anymore. Humanity was created to replace them. The specific resource or purpose isn't stated, either because the audience already knew, or because the texts themselves are incomplete, or because the information was deliberately omitted. But the sequence is clear: underground labor, divine workers, unsustainable conditions, rebellion, human creation as solution. This sequence appears in the Atrahasis epic. It appears in Enki and Ninmah. It appears in references scattered through other Mesopotamian compositions. It forms the foundation of Sumerian and Akkadian understanding of why humans exist, not spiritually, functionally. Humans exist because work needed doing and the previous workforce quit. The tablets don't ask whether this seems likely. They don't defend the claim. They document it as fact, as history, as the beginning of human story. And they do so with administrative precision, noting the labor conditions, the tool types, the negotiation process, the solution implemented. This is how it happened. This is why you're here. This is what you're for. The rebellion succeeded. The Igigi escaped their labor, but the labor didn't end. It transferred to beings made from clay and divine blood, beings with less capacity than gods, but sufficient capacity for work, beings who could reproduce and replace themselves so the labor would never lack workers again. The tablets preserve this without sentiment. It's not presented as tragedy. It's not presented as triumph. It's presented as solution. There was a problem. Work needed doing. The workers refused. New workers were created. Problem solved. The gods rejoiced. The Igigi were freed. Humanity began, and the work continued. Whatever it was, wherever it happened, deep beneath the earth where the Igigi had laboured for 3,600 years, carrying their spades and baskets into the Abzu, excavating something until their strength gave out and they chose destruction over one more day of digging. The tablets don't tell you what to feel about this. They simply note that it happened. In the beginning, before the flood, before the impossible rain lengths ended and history became recognizable, there was work in the depths. And when the workers who started that work couldn't continue it, you were made, your species, your purpose, your inheritance. The rebellion succeeded, but the labor never stopped. The Abzu, realm below the earth. In Eridu, the oldest city according to Sumerian tradition, Enki's temple bore a specific name, E2, Abzu, House of the Deep Waters. The temple wasn't metaphorically connected to underground waters. It was built at the edge of a swamp where fresh water emerged from the ground, bubbling up through springs that drew from the vast aquifer beneath southern Mesopotamia. The priests of Eridu could point to the source of the Abzu. It was there, below, the place from which water flowed without rain, without rivers, from some vast reservoir hidden in the earth. This is what the Sumerians meant by Abzu, not heaven, not the underworld of the dead. That was Ker, a different place entirely. The Abzu was the subterranean freshwater ocean believed to exist beneath the surface of the earth, extending under all land, the source from which springs and wells drew, the realm where Enki, god of wisdom, crafts, and fresh water, made his dwelling. The Akkadian term is Apsua. The cuneiform sign represents the concept as deep water, primordial water, the water that existed before creation. In Sumerian cosmology, the universe had structure, heaven above, where Anu ruled, earth in the middle, Enlil's domain, the Abzu below, Enki's territory. These weren't metaphorical divisions. They represented the Sumerian understanding of physical reality. Sky, surface, depths, and in the depths, according to multiple texts, things happened, not just divine residence. Operation, activity, work. The Epic of Gilgamesh, one of world literature's oldest surviving works, describes Gilgamesh and Enkidu travelling to the cedar forest to confront Humbaba, the guardian set there by Enlil. The text notes that Humbaba was placed to guard the secret of the gods, often translated more specifically as to guard the entrance to the Abzu, the implication being that the cedar forest, located in the mountains to the northwest of Mesopotamia, sat above or near an access point to the underground realm. The mountains, in Sumerian thought, were where Earth and Abzu came closest together, where passages might exist, where gods moved between surface and depths. The word for mountain in Sumerian is Kur, but Kur has multiple meanings depending on context. Mountain, foreign land, underground, the underworld, Earth itself. The semantic range suggests that for the Sumerians, all these concepts connected. Mountains were where you accessed underground spaces, foreign lands were mountain regions, underground was where you encountered what lay beneath the earth. The term appears repeatedly in texts about the Abzu, sometimes clearly meaning underground realm, sometimes mountain, sometimes both simultaneously. In Enki and the World Order, a Sumerian composition describing how the god Enki organized civilization and distributed responsibilities among gods, Enki operates from the Abzu as his base. He emerges from the depths to visit various lands. He assigns functions to different deities. He establishes the principles by which civilization operates. And when describing his own domain, the text says, Enki stood up in the Abzu and looked at the land. He raised his head high and looked at the land. The land is a vast place. This framing suggests the Abzu is a place from which you can observe the surface world, a vantage point below from which you can access and understand above. Enki's wisdom, for which he's famous in Mesopotamian tradition, is specifically connected to the Abzu. He dwells in the depths. He knows what lies beneath. He understands what others cannot see because his perspective is from below, looking up, seeing the hidden foundations of visible reality. The goddess Namu, sometimes called Enki's mother, is specifically identified in Sumerian texts as the mother who gave birth to heaven and earth, and she dwells in the Abzu alongside Enki. Her role is primordial. She predates the organized cosmos, and she exists in the depths, suggesting that in Sumerian thought, creation itself originated from below, from the underground waters, from the Abzu that existed before the earth's surface took its current form. When the Atrahasis epic describes the Agigi's labor, it doesn't always specify location precisely, but when location is given, it's in connection with the Abzu. They work in Enki's realm. They excavate in places associated with underground waters. When they rebel, Enki is present for the negotiations because the labor is happening in his territory. And when humanity is created to replace them, Enki assists Nintu in the creation process, providing the wise one's contribution, the intelligence, the understanding that will make humans capable of the work required. This raises a question. Academic scholars typically sidestep what kind of work happens in an underwater realm. If the Abzu is simply the water table, the aquifer that underlies Mesopotamia, what does it mean to work there? Water management. well digging, somehow both too mundane and not quite what the texts describe. They're talking about excavation, about removing earth, about operations that require tools and produce exhaustion and continue for millennia. Unless the Abzu isn't simply water, unless it's the underground realm accessed through or near water. The spaces beneath the earth where water collects, where springs originate, where, according to Sumerian geography, you could move beneath the surface in places the texts locate but don't fully explain. Archaeological evidence confirms that ancient Mesopotamians understood geological principles. They knew about aquifers. They could predict where water would be found underground. They dug wells, sometimes quite deep, using technology that included copper tools for cutting through rock. The city of Ur had wells exceeding 20 meters in depth, lined with kiln-fired bricks to prevent collapse. They weren't primitive in their understanding of underground spaces, and they described those spaces as the Abzu, the realm of fresh water, the domain of Enki, the place where certain operations occurred before humanity existed, operations significant enough that divine beings labored there for periods measured in the thousands of years, that required creating an entirely new species to continue. In later Babylonian mythology, particularly the Enuma Elish, the Abzu becomes personified. Abzu is a primordial deity, the male principle of fresh water, paired with Tiamat, the female principle of salt water. The two mingle their waters, and from their union the younger gods are born. But the younger gods are noisy. They disturb Abzu's rest. He plans to destroy them. Ea, the Babylonian name for Enki, learns of this plan and kills Abzu, establishing his dwelling in Abzu's corpse. A somewhat gruesome way of saying he takes control of the Abzu, the underground realm. This mythological cycle obscures something that's clearer in earlier Sumerian texts. The Abzu is a place, not just a being. It's geography, not just theology. It's where Enki lives, where Namu dwells, where operations happen that require workers who eventually need replacing. The temple at Eridu, E2 Abzu, included chambers built at ground level but also structures excavated below. Archaeological excavations in the 1940s by Iraqi archaeologist Fuad Safar revealed that the temple complex included subterranean rooms, spaces deliberately dug beneath the building's surface level, accessed by stairs leading down. These weren't crypts or storage, they were ritual spaces. Chambers where priests conducted ceremonies connected to the Abzu, to Enki, to the underground waters, and whatever they represented. Water has always emerged from the ground at Eridu. Modern visitors to the site can still see the swampy ground, though much drier now than in antiquity. The ancient builders chose this location because of the water. They built their first temple there before 5000 BCE, a simple structure that was rebuilt and expanded over millennia into the elaborate complex whose ruins remain. And they called it the House of the Deep Waters, because that's what it was. A place where Earth and Abzu connected, where the underground realm was accessible, where what lay beneath could be approached. In Sumerian religious practice, certain rituals required contact with the Abzu. Purification rites used water drawn from specific sources connected to underground flow. Incantations invoked Enki by referencing his dwelling in the deep. Priests claimed authority by demonstrating access to wisdom that came from below, from the hidden realm, from the waters that preceded creation. All of this makes sense if the Abzu is simply a mythological representation of groundwater, with Enki as the deity who controls that vital resource in a civilization utterly dependent on irrigation. This is the standard academic reading. The Abzu is the water table. Enki is the god of water. The mythology reflects the practical importance of water management. The temples built above springs acknowledge the divine source of a necessary resource. But this reading doesn't account for the work, the labour, the excavation that required divine workers who eventually needed replacing. Groundwater doesn't require mining. Springs don't require excavation that takes millennia. If the texts were simply about water as resource, they'd describe collecting, channeling, distributing water. Instead, they describe digging, carrying tools into the depth, sustained labour over time periods that exhaust even divine workers, creating a substitute workforce specifically to continue operations that couldn't stop. The Abzu is beneath the earth. That's consistent in every text. It's accessed through mountains or special locations. It's where Enki dwells. It's where Namu resides. It's where the Ijiji worked before they rebelled. It's physical enough to require tools, hidden enough to be called secret, important enough that when its workers quit, the gods' first crisis is how to continue the operations there. What's being extracted from the Abzu? What resource or product justifies millennia of labor? What needs to continue so urgently that humanity must be created to replace divine workers who burned their tools rather than continue one more day? The tablets don't say. They reference the location. They describe the labor. They document the rebellion and solution. But they don't name what was being mined, processed, or accomplished in the depths, either because the audience knew, because it was obvious to ancient listeners in a way it isn't to modern readers, or because the texts are incomplete fragments of longer works that contained that information in sections now lost, or because some information was transmitted outside the written record through priesthoods that didn't commit every detail to tablet. What remains is geography, the Abzu, beneath the earth, where fresh water originates, where Enki resides, where work happened that required workers, exhausted divine beings, required humans as replacement labor force. A realm the Sumerians believed existed, built temples above, accessed through ritual, referenced in their creation accounts as the location where humanity's purpose began. Not in heaven, not in the gods' council chambers, in the depths, in the underground waters, in the place beneath the surface where what needed doing got done, where labor continued for periods beyond human comprehension, where the work was so demanding that even gods, beings with capabilities humans would never match, found it unbearable and refused to continue. The Abzu, house of the deep waters, realm where your species' story began, where work waited, where workers failed, where you were made to replace them. The tablets remember the location, they preserve the name, they mark the spot on their cosmic map. Here beneath, in the waters that precede creation and underlie everything built after. This is where it happened. This is where it still happens if the labor never stopped. The depths remember what surface forgets, and the Sumerians, building their temples above springs, digging their ritual chambers below ground level, invoking Enki of the Abzu, didn't forget. They kept the memory. They wrote it in clay. They named the place. And the place was under the earth. What the tablets say about extraction. The Sumerian word is Su, tag. It appears in administrative texts, in literary compositions, in lexical lists where scribes compiled vocabularies. The cuneiform combines the sign for hand, nu, with the sign for touching or handling, tag. Together, to touch with the hand, to take hold of, to work with the hands. But context determines meaning. In temple accounting tablets from Gersu, dated to around 2050 BCE, U-tag appears in lists of workers assigned to operations involving earth removal. The texts specify daily quotas, how much earth each worker should move, how deep the excavation should go, what tools they're issued. The word functions as technical terminology for extraction work. In Enki and the World Order, the composition where Enki organizes civilizations' various crafts and assigns them to appropriate deities, the god visits different lands and establishes their particular functions. When he reaches the Silver Mountains and Lapis Lazuli Mountains, the text says, "For Aratta he made it rain for the Silver Mountains, for the Golden Mountains, for the Copper Mountains, for the Lapis Lazuli Mountains." Then it describes how he established Nidaba, goddess of writing and grain, in the mountain land, and how he gave special status to Aratta's artisans who work with precious materials. The text doesn't describe mining explicitly. The Sumerian term for digging deep shafts, ba-al, doesn't appear here, but it establishes that mountains contain resources, that extracting those resources requires specific knowledge, and that certain deities oversee these operations. The word Kur runs through these texts like a river through stone. Mountain, foreign land, underworld, underground. The semantic range reflects how Sumerians organized their geography. The alluvial plain where their cities sat was flat, formed by millennia of river silt. Mountains were foreign, the Zagros to the east, the Taurus to the north, the highlands where Mesopotamia's rivers originated, and mountains were where resources came from. Timber from mountain forests, stone from mountain quarries, metals from mountain regions. Copper they called Uruda. The sign is ancient, predating most cuneiform writing. Archaeological evidence confirms copper use in Mesopotamia from at least 5000 BCE, imported from sources in what's now eastern Turkey, the Egani-Mardan region, and the area around Lake Van. By 3000 BCE, Mesopotamian metalsmiths were producing sophisticated copper objects, developing arsenical bronze, eventually adopting tin bronze. None of these metals originated in southern Mesopotamia. All required trade networks reaching into mountainous regions hundreds of kilometers away. Silver was Ko. baba, literally shining white metal. Gold was ko siji, shining yellow metal. Both were prestige materials, appearing in royal burials, temple furnishings, elite jewelry. Neither existed naturally in the river plains of Sumer. Both came from elsewhere, from mountains, from places where KUR meant both foreign and underground simultaneously. The administrative text from early dynastic Sumer, 2900–350 BCE, track metal imports with bureaucratic precision. Tablets from Ur, from Lagash, from Umma, list copper shipments measured in talents, roughly 30 kilograms per talent, noting origin points, quantities, intended purposes. Some texts reference copper coming from Dilmun, probably modern Bahrain, which served as transshipment point for ore from even further away, possibly Oman, possibly the Indus Valley. Others note overland sources from the mountains to the north and east. What the texts don't describe is mining operations conducted by Sumerians themselves. They describe acquiring already processed metal, they describe trade, they describe workshops where metals are cast, forged, alloyed, but they don't place Sumerian workers in mountain mines, don't describe Sumerian excavation of underground ore deposits. Yet the mythological texts describe exactly that. Excavation, tool carrying, underground operations, exhaustive labour extracting something from the depths. The Atrahasis epics Ijiji don't import materials, they dig them out. They work in the Abzu, the underground realm. They carry spades and baskets in operations that continue for thousands of years. And when they can't continue, humans are created specifically to take over this work. There's a gap here. Historical texts describe trade. Mythological texts describe extraction. Historical texts place metal production in foreign mountain regions. Mythological texts place the critical labour underground, in the Abzu, in Enki's territory. Historical texts never mention gods. Mythological texts rarely mention specific resources, unless you read them together, unless the mythological texts are preserving memory of something historical texts don't record. Not because it didn't happen, but because by the historical period it was already distant memory. By the time scribes were tracking copper shipments from Dilmun, the period when gods directed underground operations was already mythology, already belonging to the time before the flood, before impossible reign lengths ended, before the world took its current familiar form. Samuel Noah Kramer noted this pattern. His translations of Sumerian literary texts revealed that myths often encoded practical knowledge. The story of Enki and Ninhursag isn't just entertainment, it preserves botanical knowledge, plant properties, medical applications. The story of Inanna and the Hulupu tree isn't just narrative, it describes woodworking, tool making, practical crafts. Sumerian myths function as cultural repositories, preserving information in memorable story form. So what information does the Ijiji rebellion preserve? What's being encoded in a story about divine underground labour, unsustainable working conditions, and the creation of humans as substitute workforce? One possibility: collective memory of mining operations so ancient that by the time Sumerians were writing them down, the operations had become attributed to gods. Humans couldn't have done this, so gods must have. Or humans did this under divine direction, working for beings with superior knowledge, and the stories preserve that relationship. Another possibility: the texts aren't about mining as we understand it. They're about something else. Underground water management at a scale that required massive labour perhaps. The excavation of aquifer access tunnels. The creation of underground chambers for purposes the texts don't specify. Operations that genuinely did take millennia, that involved generations of workers, that by the time of the historical texts had become incomprehensible except as myth. A third possibility: the texts mean what they say, describing operations conducted by beings the Sumerians called gods, beings with longer lifespans, superior capabilities, different origins, who did in fact work underground, extracting resources for reasons that made sense to them, but that the texts, written from human perspective, don't fully explain because humans weren't present for those operations, only created afterward to continue work. The original workers couldn't sustain. Academic scholarship defaults to the first possibility, viewing mythological labour as projection of human experience onto divine figures. This is methodologically sound. Don't multiply entities unnecessarily. Explain text in terms of human culture and psychology. Recognize mythology as cultural product. Myths aren't historical documents. They're stories that reveal how societies understood themselves, their origins, their relationship to the divine. But this approach struggles with the specificity, the tool vocabulary, the extraction terminology, the underground location, the consistency across texts. If this is simply agricultural society projecting its labour concerns onto divine mythology, why not place the divine labour in fields? Why deep places? Why excavation rather than ploughing? Why does Enki, god of wisdom and water, oversee these operations rather than, say, Enlil, who's specifically associated with agricultural abundance? The text, Enki and the World Order, provides partial answer. In that composition, Enki assigns different gods to different civilizational functions. Enlil gets agriculture, Utu gets law and justice, Inanna gets warfare and love, Nidaba gets grain and writing. The gods specialize. Each oversees particular domains, and Enki's domain is the underground realm, the Abzu, the place where operations requiring specific knowledge occur, the knowledge Enki possesses, the wisdom that distinguishes him. In Mesopotamian tradition, Enki is the clever god, the problem solver, the one who understands how things work beneath surface appearances. When humanity is threatened with destruction by flood, Enki devises the solution, warning, Ziusudra Atrahasis, preserving the seed of civilization. When the gods need workers created, Enki contributes the crucial element, the wise one's touch that makes humans capable of complex labor. When civilization needs organizing, Enki travels from the Abzu to establish how things should function. His sphere is subterranean. His perspective is from below, looking up. His knowledge concerns what lies beneath. And in the time before humans, his sphere is where the critical labor happens. Labor so demanding that even gods can't sustain it indefinitely. What kind of operation requires the oversight of the wisdom god? What kind of extraction demands specialized knowledge rather than simple physical labor? What's complex enough that creating substitute workers requires divine intelligence to ensure those workers have sufficient capacity? The tablets don't answer directly. They circle the answer, describing the labor without naming the product, documenting the location without specifying the resource, preserving the memory without revealing the purpose. Or perhaps they do reveal it, and the revelation is in what they take for granted, that mountains contain wealth, that depth means resources, that extraction requires knowledge, that some work must continue regardless of cost, that the structure of civilization depends on labor in places most never see, accessing materials most never touch, maintaining operations so fundamental that the gods themselves couldn't let them stop, even when their workers burned their tools in revolt. The Sumerians built civilization in a resource, poor plain. Everything they needed, timber, stone, metal, came from elsewhere, from mountains, from foreign lands, from places where KUR meant both underground and far away simultaneously. They developed trade networks spanning thousands of kilometers. They created administrative systems tracking resource flows with extraordinary precision. They understood deeply that civilization requires extraction, that settled society depends on accessing what lies beneath or beyond the visible horizon. And their oldest myths, their creation accounts, their stories about why humans exist, these all circle back to labor in the depths, to operations requiring workers who eventually need replacing, to a time when the relationship between surface and underground, between those who direct and those who dig, was structured differently. The tablets preserve the vocabulary. Utag, work with hands. Baal, dig deep. KUR, mountain, underground, foreign place. Uruda, copper. Kupabar, silver. Abzu, the depths. The words remain in cuneiform, pressed into clay, specific and technical, and pointing toward operations the Sumerians remembered even when the memory no longer made complete sense. What were the Anunnaki mining deep underground? The texts don't say directly. They say work was happening there. They say it required divine oversight. They say it exhausted the original workers. They say humans were created to continue it. The question hangs in the vocabulary of extraction, in the geography of depths, in the consistent pattern across independent sources. Something was being taken from beneath the earth, something valuable enough to require millennia of labor, something necessary enough that when the workers quit, an entire species had to be created to replace them. The tablets remember the work, they preserve the location, they document the solution. The specific product disappears into damaged clay and incomplete context, but the operation itself, that remains. described with administrative precision in the oldest written accounts of human origins. You were made for work. The tablets agree on this. And the work was happening underground, in the Abzu, in the realm of the wisdom god, extracting something the texts no longer name but the Sumerians never forgot was the reason you exist. The geology. They would have known southern Mesopotamia is an alluvial plain. River silt deposited over millennia by the Tigris and Euphrates, layer upon layer of sediment creating land where once there was marshland and shallow sea. No bedrock outcrops, no stone quarries, no metal ores. The oldest Sumerian cities, Eridu, Ur, Uruk, Lagash, were built entirely from mud brick because mud was what the land provided. When these cities needed stone, they imported it. When they needed metal, they traded for it. When they needed timber, it came from distant mountains. The Sumerians knew this. Their administrative tablets track it with bureaucratic precision. A text from Lagash, dated to around 2400 BCE, lists a shipment of diorite stone, a hard, dark stone used for sculpture and prestige objects. The text notes the stone came from Magan, probably the Oman Peninsula, transported by ship across the Persian Gulf up the waterways to the city. The weight is recorded. The transport cost is noted. The intended use is specified, a statue for the temple. Another tablet from Ur, slightly later, tracks copper ingots arriving from Dilmun. The text distinguishes between refined copper and raw ore, suggesting the Sumerians understood metallurgical processing. It notes quality. Some copper is described as pure, other batches as needing further refinement. The prices vary accordingly. The destinations are listed. So much for the temple workshop, so much for the palace metal workers, so much held in reserve. These texts reveal sophisticated understanding of geological reality. The Sumerians knew where resources came from. They knew why they had to import them. They knew the difference between raw materials and processed goods. They weren't primitive in their understanding of the Earth's composition, and they knew what lay beneath their feet: water. The aquifer that underlies Mesopotamia, fed by mountain snowmelt filtering down through limestone and sandstone, collecting in underground chambers and channels, emerging in springs at places where geological structure allowed. At Eridu, where Enki's temple stood, water bubbled to the surface naturally. At other locations, wells had to be dug, sometimes shallow, sometimes requiring excavations of 20 meters or more to reach the water table. The technology for deep wells existed by the early dynastic period. Ur's wells were lined with kiln-fired brick, circular shafts descending through the soft alluvial soil to reach water below. The engineering wasn't simple. Preventing collapse required understanding of soil mechanics. Maintaining water quality required knowledge of how to seal the well from surface contamination. The Sumerians possessed this knowledge. They applied it systematically. But wells aren't mines. Accessing water doesn't require the kind of extraction labour the mythological texts describe. The Igigi's work, the digging, the carrying of earth in baskets, the excavation that continues for thousands of years. This isn't well digging. It's something more extensive, more sustained. Something that requires not just accessing what's underground, but removing it, processing it, continuing the operation indefinitely. The nearest geological sources for metals that interested the Sumerians lay hundreds of kilometres away. To the north and east, in the Zagros Mountains and the Armenian highlands, copper deposits existed at places like Egani Madin, in what's now southeastern Turkey. These deposits had been exploited since the Neolithic. Archaeological surveys have found ancient mining sites with stone hammers, slag heaps, evidence of fire-setting techniques where rock was heated, then rapidly cooled to crack it, allowing ore removal. Lake Van in the Armenian highlands sits in a volcanic region where copper mineralization occurs naturally. The lake itself is saline, but streams feeding it carry copper in solution from ore bodies in surrounding mountains. Ancient peoples could have followed these indicators to find source deposits. Some scholars suggest Lake Van served as copper source for northern Mesopotamia as early as 4000 BCE. Further south and east, in what's now Iran, the Zagros range contains scattered copper deposits. The ancient kingdom of Elam, Mesopotamia's frequent rival and sometime trading partner, controlled access to some of these resources. Sumerian texts mention trade with Elam, sometimes peaceful, often not. Competition over resources, specifically metal resources, may underlie some of the conflict these texts record. To the southeast, across the Persian Gulf, the Oman Peninsula, ancient Magan in Sumerian texts, contained copper deposits that were extensively exploited in antiquity. Archaeological work at sites like Al-Hajar has revealed ancient mining operations with radiocarbon dates reaching back to 30,000 BCE. Or, was smelted on site, producing ingots that were traded throughout the Persian Gulf and beyond. Sumerian tablets mention magan, copper specifically, sometimes describing it as particularly pure. The pattern is clear. Metals came from mountains, from foreign lands, from places where geological processes had concentrated ores. Southern Mesopotamia, formed by river sedimentation, lacked these resources entirely. The Sumerians were dependent on trade networks, on relationships with peoples who controlled mountain regions, on access to resources their own land couldn't provide. This dependency shaped Sumerian politics, economics, culture. Control of trade routes meant power. Access to copper meant military advantage. Bronze weapons and tools were superior to stone. Maintaining friendly relations with source regions was strategic necessity. The administrative apparatus of Sumerian city-states dedicated enormous resources to managing these relationships and tracking resource flows. And yet, the mythological texts don't describe trade, they describe direct extraction. They place gods. Sumerian gods, operating from Sumerian territory, the Abzu, which Enki controls from Eridu, conducting underground operations that require massive labour. They don't describe importing copper from Magan, they describe digging it out, excavating it, working in the depths to extract it. This creates interpretive tension. Historical reality shows trade. Mythological texts show extraction. Historical texts place resources in distant mountains. Mythological texts place operations underground in Mesopotamia itself, in the Abzu beneath the surface. One resolution: the myths aren't about Mesopotamia. They're borrowed from mountain peoples who actually did mine, whose stories got incorporated into Sumerian tradition. But this doesn't account for the myths being central to Sumerian identity, not peripheral. The creation of humanity, the EGG rebellion, the Abzu operations, these are foundational Sumerian narratives, not imported tales. Another resolution: the myths are metaphorical, representing Mesopotamian understanding of how resources emerge from underground without concerning themselves with geographical accuracy. The mining is really about wells, about accessing the Abzu's water, with later readers mistakenly taking extraction language literally. But this requires ignoring specific vocabulary. The texts distinguish between water access and excavation. When they describe well digging or water management, they use appropriate terms. When they describe the Igig's labour, they use extraction vocabulary, removal, carrying away, taking out. The semantic distinction suggests the texts aren't conflating water access with ore extraction. They're describing different activities. A third possibility, usually unspoken in academic literature: what if geological knowledge in deep antiquity was different than the historical record suggests? What if resource deposits existed that were exhausted before the historical period, leaving no trace except in collective memory preserved as myth? This seems unlikely for major metal deposits. Ore bodies leave geological signatures. Even exhausted mines leave evidence: slag heaps, tailings, disturbed ground. Archaeological survey in southern Mesopotamia has been extensive, especially in the 20th century. No evidence of ancient copper mining has been found in the alluvial plain. The geology doesn't support it. Unless the operations weren't in the alluvial plain, unless underground meant something more specific, locations where geological structure did permit extraction, places the texts locate in the Abzu, not because they were in southern Mesopotamia, but because the Abzu itself extends beyond Sumerian territory, connecting underground spaces across regions. This interpretation requires treating the Abzu as more than metaphor, as actual geological feature. The aquifer system, yes, but also the underground spaces connected to it, the chambers and channels through which water moves, the places where water has dissolved limestone creating caverns, where geological processes create accessible underground environments. Karst topography, regions where soluble bedrock has been eroded by water, creating caves, sinkholes, underground rivers, exists in parts of the Zagros mountain. It exists in the limestone formations of the Armenian highlands. Ancient peoples could access these underground spaces, could explore them, could conduct operations in them, and could describe them as the Abzu, as the underground realm of fresh water, as places connected to Enki's domain even though they're geographically distant from Eridu, because what defines the Abzu isn't surface location, but depth, underground nature, connection to the hidden waters that underlie and connect all lands. This reading isn't standard. It requires taking mythological geography seriously as geography, not just as symbolic cosmology, but it resolves the tension between historical trade and mythological extraction. Resources came from mountains, which are where earth and underground meet, where the Abzu is accessible, where operations requiring underground work actually occurred. The Ijiji worked there, in mountain caves and excavated chambers, extracting ores or conducting other operations the texts don't specify. When they could no longer continue, humans were created to replace them. Not necessarily Sumerian humans specifically, but humans as species, spreading through regions where the work needed doing. The Sumerian texts preserve this from their perspective, from Eridu, where Enki's temple stood above the spring, where the Abzu was tangibly present in the water emerging from ground. To them, all underground operations connected to the Abzu, because the Abzu was the underground realm. Period. Work happening in Zagros mountain caves was work in the Abzu. Extraction in Armenian highland mines was operation in Enki's domain. The geography was theological, cosmic, connecting underground spaces regardless of surface distance between them. This interpretation is speculative. It goes beyond what texts explicitly state, but it accounts for details standard readings struggle with. Why extraction language if only water is meant? Why mountain connections if purely Mesopotamian context? Why the emphasis on underground if surface trade is the reality? The Sumerians knew geology well enough to understand their resource limitations. They developed complex systems to compensate. They didn't romanticize this. Their administrative texts are grimly practical about costs, distances, risks of trade. They knew exactly where metals came from and what obtaining them required, and they told stories about a time when the obtaining was different. When work happened directly, underground, by beings with capabilities humans lack. When the extraction was so demanding that even those superior beings couldn't sustain it. When humanity was created specifically to continue operations that couldn't be allowed to stop. Maybe this is pure projection. Bronze Age society dependent on metal imports, inventing myths that explain resource scarcity as divine labor crisis. Maybe it's cultural memory distorted beyond historical recognition, actual mining by actual people, attributed to gods through generations of retelling. Maybe it's something else entirely, preserved in language we can read, but contexts we can no longer fully reconstruct. What remains is the mismatch. Historical texts show one thing, mythological texts show another, and the Sumerians, who weren't stupid, who tracked resource flows with extraordinary precision, who understood perfectly well where metals actually came from in their own time. Those Sumerians told stories about direct extraction from underground, about work in the Abzu, about operations so fundamental that when workers failed, a new species had to be created to replace them. The geology they knew limited what was possible in their territory. The geology they remembered, preserved in texts about earlier times, described operations in the depths, in underground spaces, in places where what the earth contained could be accessed and removed through labour measured in millennia. The discrepancy sits there in the tablets, undeniable and unexplained. What they knew and what they remembered don't quite match, and the gap between them is where the question lives. What were the Anunnaki mining deep underground, in a time before trade routes, before the flood, before the world took its current form, where resources come from elsewhere, and humans do the work of bringing them home? The creation that followed the toil. The tablet is badly damaged. CBS 206-8, part of the University of Pennsylvania's collection, excavated from Nippur sometime during the early expeditions. The surface is abraded, entire sections are missing, but enough remains to read the process. Enki and Ninmah is what scholars call this composition, how humanity was made. Not why, that's clear enough in other texts, the replacement workforce for exhausted gods. But how? The procedure, the technique, the details that make this read less like creation myth and more like laboratory notes. Enki speaks to Namu, the primordial mother, the creature whose name you called. It exists. Bind on it the image of the gods. The word translated as image is alan, which can mean figure, form, statue, representation, physical form in other words, not abstract essence, shape, structure, the thing you could see if you looked at it. Namu then gathers the birth goddesses. The text names them Ninmah, Ninhasaga, Ninbara, Ninmug, Musadu, Ninigina, Ninkura. 7 goddesses, specialists in birth. They're instructed to assist. This isn't solo creation. It requires team effort, multiple divine hands working together on a complex task. Then the materials, she mixed the clay from the top of the Abzu. Not random clay, clay from a specific location, the top of the Abzu, the boundary between underground waters and earth above. The Sumerian term is im, clay suitable for tablet writing, for brick making, for forming objects. Good clay, proper material. But clay alone isn't sufficient. The text continues. The clay from the flesh and blood of the god, Enki fashioned. This is the element from the slaughtered god, the one who had the plan for rebellion. His flesh and blood are mixed with clay. The Akkadian version, Atrahasis, is more explicit about this. The god's blood provides intelligence, his flesh provides substance. The clay from the Abzu provides form. Together, these materials create something new. Ninmah begins the shaping. The text describes her speaking incantations over the clay as she works. Ritual words, formulaic phrases that accompany the physical process. In Mesopotamian thought, words and actions work together. Speaking alone accomplishes nothing. Action without proper words fails. The two must combine. Ninmah shapes while speaking, her words binding what her hands form. The first attempts aren't successful. This is where Enki and Ninmah become strange. The text describes a series of creations, each flawed. A being who cannot hold back urine, one who cannot see, one who cannot hold a weapon, one whose body trembles constantly. 6 creatures, each with a significant disability, each brought before Enki, who must find a place for them in civilization. The incontinent one becomes a court attendant, the blind one becomes a singer, the weak one becomes a metalworker's apprentice. This reads like trial and error, like a process being refined through repeated attempts, each revealing a problem that must be corrected in subsequent iterations. The text treats this matter-of-factly. Creation isn't instantaneous perfection. It's procedure, adjustment, problem-solving until the result meets requirement. Only after these flawed attempts does the text describe successful human creation. 14 beings, 7 male, 7 female, properly formed, capable of the work required. These are the Aulam, the word that means both human and worker in Akkadian. These are who persist, who reproduce, who spread, who become humanity. But there's an addition to these final successful versions. Enki gave them understanding. The Sumerian term is Geiktu, sometimes translated as wisdom, sometimes as understanding or intelligence. It's associated with the ears, literally ear opening, the ability to hear and comprehend instruction. The flawed versions lacked this. The successful versions receive it. And this, the text suggests, is Enki's specific contribution, the capacity for understanding that makes humans capable of complex work. There's a parallel text, a Sumerian composition called The Creation of the Pickaxe, which approaches the same event from a different angle. In that text, Enlil creates a tool, a pickaxe specifically designed for humans to use. Then he creates humans to use it. The order is significant. Tool first, users second. The instrument of labor precedes the laborers, and the tool is specifically designed for excavation, for digging, for breaking earth. The Al, the Sumerian pickaxe, designed for heavy work. The text says Enlil set the pickaxe and basket before the assembly. The pickaxe for breaking ground, the basket for carrying away what's broken. These are the tools the Ajiji burned when they rebelled. Now they're remade, presented as instruments for the new workforce. The text continues. Enlil gave them the pickaxe to use. They set their hands to it. The people pressed the pickaxe into the soil. This is immediate deployment. Human creation followed by immediate assignment to labor. No period of wandering in gardens, no age of ease. The texts that describe Eden-like conditions. There are Sumerian versions of paradise. Place those in a different context, a special creation for special individuals, not the general human condition. For most humans, for the Orlan created as replacement workforce, work begins immediately. The purpose is stated explicitly in multiple texts. In Atrahasis, let him bear the yoke, let him carry the work of the gods. In Enki and Ninmah, the creature will do the work which the gods had to do. In Enuma Elish, the later Babylonian version, I will create Lalu, man will be its name. I will create Lalu, man. The task of the gods shall be his task. Lalu is interesting. It's sometimes translated as primitive man or savage, but etymologically it may derive from a root meaning mixture or hybrid, something created from combined elements. clay and divine blood, earth and heaven, material that can be shaped, and intelligence that allows complex labor, not fully divine. The texts are clear. Humans lack God's lifespan and power, but not purely natural either, something fashioned, designed, created with purpose. The creation happens after the rebellion. This sequence is consistent across texts. First, the Ijiji work. Second, they refuse. Third, humans are created as solution. The timing matters. Humans don't exist in some primordial state, then get assigned to work. Humans exist because work needs doing and previous work has failed. Creation and purpose are inseparable. You can't understand what humans are without understanding what humans are for. Academic interpretation views this as social justification. A civilization stratified between laborers and elites would naturally develop creation myths where labor is humanity's defining purpose. It explains suffering. Even in beginning, humans were made to work. It reinforces hierarchy. Some command because they represent God's will. Others labor because that's their created function. The myth serves ideology, maintaining social structures that benefit ruling classes. This interpretation is persuasive for late Bronze Age and later periods, when these texts were being copied and recopied in urban centers with complex social stratification. But it doesn't account for the text's antiquity. The language contains archaic features suggesting composition before the social structures the myths supposedly justify. The Sumerian literary tradition preserves this material from periods when Sumerian civilization was just forming, when the social hierarchy was less rigid, when the relationship between rulers and ruled was still being negotiated. What if the sequence is reversed? What if social structures developed to match remembered creation accounts, rather than creation accounts being invented to justify social structures? What if the Sumerians organized their labor systems the way they did because they genuinely believed, that humanity had been created as workforce, that gods had precedent in organizing labor hierarchies, that the proper order reflected divine intention? This seems less likely to modern scholars who view social structures as emerging from material conditions, economics, power struggles, not from religious ideas. But the Sumerians didn't separate religion from reality. Their cosmology was their reality. If the text said humans were made to work, then work was what humans did, and organizing work efficiently was aligning human society with divine creation plan. The creation process includes one more element that most translations gloss over. After Ninmah shapes the clay, after Enki gives understanding, the text says, the birth goddesses sang the birth song. The Sumerian is Sir-ne-re, a song that accompanies bringing forth, but accompanied by something else. They counted the months. The appointed time arrived. Months, plural, a period of gestation. The created humans don't appear instantly. There's a process, a duration, something that takes time to complete. This seems like mythological embellishment, giving the story a birth narrative that matches human reproduction, but it could be read differently, as indicating that whatever creation process occurred, it wasn't instantaneous. It required time, monitoring, waiting for something to complete. The text treats this as normal, expected, the way birth works. But humans weren't born. They were made from clay and divine substance. So why the waiting period? Why months? Why the attention to process duration? The text doesn't explain. It simply notes the time, the counting, the arrival of the appointed moment. Then they release the newborns. The word is Nam-lu, Ulu, humanity as collective noun, not individuals, a population. Multiple beings, ready simultaneously, delivered together. The birth song isn't for one child, it's for a workforce. And immediately they were placed at the pickaxe and the basket. From creation to labour in one textual breath, the transition is instantaneous, the purpose is clear. These beings exist to work, to carry the burden. The Ijiji refused, to continue operations that cannot stop. The tablets preserve this without judgment. Modern readers bring our own sensibilities. Creation for labour seems exploitative, reducing humans to tools. But the Sumerian texts don't editorialize. They document. This is how it happened. This is why you exist. This is what you're for. The information is delivered as fact, as historical record, as explanation for the human condition. Everyone experiencing it can verify, life is work, work defines life. This has been true from the beginning, because the beginning was work that needed doing. Later, religious traditions would soften this. Humans created in divine image for fellowship. Humans as beloved creation. Humans granted autonomy and meaning beyond labour. But the Sumerian version, the oldest version, is grimmer and more direct. You were made because workers were needed. You exist because others refused to continue. Your purpose is functional. Your value is in what you accomplish. Work is not punishment for some primordial sin. Work is the reason for your existence. You are the solution to a labour crisis that predates your species. The tablets sit in museums now. CBS 268 with its abraded surface and missing chunks. Other fragments scattered across collections worldwide. But what remains readable is enough. The procedure, the materials, the trial and error, the successful creation of beings with just enough intelligence to understand instruction, just enough strength to use the tools provided, just enough capacity to reproduce and replace themselves so the labour never lacks workers. From clay of the Abzu, from blood of rebellious god, shaped by birth goddesses speaking incantations, given understanding by the wisdom god, monitored through months until completion, released to pickaxe and basket. This is how humanity began, according to the oldest written accounts. This is the answer to why you're here. Not comforting, not elevating, just functional. You exist because work needs doing. Everything else, your consciousness, your creativity, your capacity for joy or suffering, those are incidental features of a design meant primarily to produce workers capable of continuing operations that couldn't stop when the original workforce burned their tools and refused another day in the depths. The creation followed the toil. The solution followed the crisis. You followed the Ijiji's rebellion, and the work they couldn't bear became the work that defines you, written into your creation, inseparable from your existence. The purpose that justified mixing clay with divine blood and shaping something that would reproduce itself endlessly, generation after generation, providing workers for operations that the texts describe but never quite explain, made from clay. Given understanding, placed at the basket. This is what the tablets say. This is how it happened. This is why. The Council of Assigners. The British Museum holds fragments of 7 tablets, all containing portions of the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic. Catalogue numbers K 5419, C 93117, 54228, and others. They date to the Neo-Assyrian period, roughly 7th century BCE, copies made for the library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh. But the text they preserve is older, probably composed in the early 2nd millennium BCE, during Babylon's rise to regional dominance. And it draws on even older material. Sumerian traditions, mythological cycles that predate Babylonian culture itself. The Enuma Elish tells creation differently than Sumerian texts. It's more cosmic, more concerned with divine politics and the establishment of Marduk as supreme god. It's propaganda in a sense. Babylonian theology asserting Marduk's supremacy over older Sumerian deities, but buried within its 7 tablets is the same sequence: divine labour, crisis, creation of humanity as solution. The epic begins with primordial waters, Apsu fresh water and Tiamat salt water mingling. From their union younger gods emerge. But the younger gods are noisy. They disturb Apsu's rest. He plans to destroy them. Ea, Enki's Babylonian name, learns of this, kills Apsu, establishes his dwelling in Apsu's corpse, which is a mythological way of saying he takes control of the underground realm. Tiamat, enraged by her consort's death, creates monsters to wage war against the younger gods. The gods are terrified. None can face her. Finally, Marduk volunteers, but demands a price. If he defeats Tiamat, he must be acknowledged as king of the gods, supreme over all, his word, law. The gods agree. Marduk slaughters Tiamat, splits her body, creates heaven and earth from her corpse. Then he organizes the cosmos, assigns functions to various gods, establishes the cosmic order, and then comes Tablet the Sixth, the creation of humanity. Marduk convenes the Anunnaki. In the Anunnaki are the senior gods, the Great Council. They gather to hear Marduk's plans for organizing the newly created world, and Marduk proposes, I shall create Lala, Man shall be his name. I shall create Lala, man. He shall be charged with the service of the gods, that they may have rest. But the creation requires sacrifice. One god must die. The question is, who? Ea speaks, let one of their brothers be given up. He alone shall perish, that mankind may be created. Then he asks, which god should be selected? The assembly chooses. Kingu was it who made war, who caused Tiamat to revolt and do battle. Kingu was Tiamat's second consort, commander of her monstrous army, leader of the failed rebellion against the younger gods. He seized, his blood extracted, and from his blood humanity is created. The text is explicit about this. From his blood he created mankind. He imposed the service of the gods upon them and set the gods free. This mirrors the Atrahasis creation. Rebel God's blood becomes humanity's substance. But here there's additional detail. He divided the Anunnaki into two groups. He made 600 stay in heaven. He deployed another 600 on earth. 1,200 Anunnaki, 600 above, 600 below. The text doesn't explain what the earthbound Anunnaki do, but their presence matters. They're stationed, deployed. Language of organization, of assignment, of administrative structure. The Anunnaki aren't simply divine beings. They're functionaries, administrators, overseers, and humanity serves them. The text says the humans shall maintain the gods' estates, which could mean temple service. And certainly later Mesopotamian culture interpreted it that way, with temples functioning as major economic centers requiring vast labor forces. But the word translated estates is ilku, which in Akkadian means work obligation, service owed, duty assigned. It's administrative terminology, legal language, the kind of vocabulary used in texts about labor organization, corvée duty, assigned service. Then comes a curious section. The Anunnaki themselves speak, "Now, O Lord, you who have brought about our deliverance from work, what shall be our sign of gratitude before you?" They ask what token, what monument they can create to honor Marduk for freeing them from labor. The answer is Babylon itself, specifically the temple complex Esagila, Marduk's earthly residence. The Anunnaki spend a whole year manufacturing bricks to build it. Then, when complete, they celebrate a whole year making bricks. The Anunnaki, gods working in construction, producing building materials, engaged in manual labor. The text treats this as a special event, a one-time service to honor Marduk. But it acknowledges that gods can do manual labor, have done manual labor, understand the burden of physical work. And now they're freed from it, because humans exist, because the service of the gods has been imposed on humans, because the labor burden has transferred. The Enuma Elish is Babylonian, not Sumerian. It's written in Akkadian, not Sumerian. It dates to a period when Mesopotamian civilization was already ancient, when social structures were firmly established, when the relationship between rulers and ruled was codified in law. Academic scholarship treats it as theological propaganda, Babylon asserting its supremacy through mythological revision, elevating Marduk above earlier gods. But beneath the Babylonian overlay, the Sumerian sequence persists. Divine labor, divine exhaustion, rebel leaders' blood creating humanity, humanity assigned to continue the work. The Anunnaki divided into groups, some stationed in heaven, some on earth. Humanity serving those stationed on earth, maintaining their estates, bearing the ilku, the work obligation. The text uses administrative vocabulary. It describes organizational structure. It presents the cosmos as bureaucracy, with clear hierarchies, assigned functions, specified duties. This matches how Mesopotamian society actually operated. Temple complexes as administrative centers, priests as managers, labor organized through sophisticated systems of accounting and obligation. The Enuma Elish projects this structure onto the cosmos, as below, so above, or perhaps as above, so below. Humanity imitating divine organizational patterns. What's significant is the Anunnaki's role. They're not simply gods to be worshipped. They're administrators, assigners of function, overseers of operations. The 600 stationed on Earth have tasks, territories, responsibilities, and humanity, created from rebel blood, serves them. Later Mesopotamian texts elaborate this structure. The god list Anum, compiled over centuries, names over 2,000 deities organized hierarchically. The Anunnaki appear as a class within this structure, senior gods, decision makers, but below the absolute highest tier of Anu, Enlil, Enki. They're middle management in modern terms. They answer to higher authority, but exercise authority over lower ranks. and humanity is below them, created to serve them, assigned to their supervision. The work that needed doing, the work that led to the Ijiji rebellion in earlier texts, now happens under Anunnaki oversight, performed by human hands. What work, specifically? The Enuma Elish doesn't detail it, neither do most Sumerian texts. They reference it, the service of the gods, the bearing of the yoke, the maintaining of estates, but they don't specify daily operations, don't describe what tasks humanity actually performs that constitutes this service. Temple texts are more specific. Administrative tablets from Sumerian and Akkadian cities detail temple operations, agriculture on temple lands, animal husbandry, textile production, beer brewing, construction projects. Thousands of people supported each major temple complex. Their labor was tracked meticulously, rations issued, tasks assigned, output measured. The temples functioned as economic engines, redistributing resources, organizing production, managing labor forces that dwarfed any private enterprise. So, perhaps the service of the gods simply means this: temple labor, the maintenance of religious institutions, the support of priestly hierarchies. Humanity created to support a religious system where the Anunnaki's earthly representatives, priests, kings, administrators, direct labor for purposes both spiritual and practical. But this reading requires ignoring the text's own chronology. The Anunnaki are stationed on Earth after humanity is created, not before. They don't arrive to find humans conveniently available for labor. They're deployed to Earth as part of the same organizational plan that creates humans. The two events are connected, part of the same cosmic reorganization that followed the Ijiji rebellion and Tiamat's defeat. If the Anunnaki weren't on Earth before humanity, what service could humanity be created to provide? Who needed serving if the server's supervisors arrived simultaneously? Unless the operations predated both, the work was already happening. The Ijiji's work in the Abzu, the rebellion created the crisis, and the solution involved both replacing workers, create humans, and organizing oversight, station Anunnaki on Earth to supervise. That's what the Anunnaki function as in these texts. They divide tasks, they establish boundaries, they determine who does what. When Marduk organizes the cosmos, he does so through the Anunnaki assembly. He doesn't decree alone, he consults, he assigns, he delegates. And the Anunnaki, in turn, oversee their assigned domains. In Sumerian texts predating the Enuma Elish, this function is clearer. Enki in the World Order shows Enki traveling to various lands, establishing how each should function, assigning specific gods to oversee specific domains. To Nanshi he gives the Persian Gulf, to Nisaba he gives grain and writing, to Uttu he gives weaving. Each deity receives a sphere, a responsibility, a territory or function there to maintain. Humanity fits into this organized cosmos as workers, not slaves exactly. The Mesopotamian conception is more complex than simple slavery. Servants maybe, obligated labourers, beings who owe service, who exist to fulfill duties assigned by those above them in the cosmic hierarchy, who work because work is their purpose, and refusing work would be refusing their created function. The tablets preserve this organizational structure because Mesopotamian society reflected it. Temple and palace economies depended on mass labour. Agricultural surplus required irrigation systems demanding coordinated effort. Construction projects, ziggurats, city walls, canal networks required mobilizing thousands. The society couldn't function without sophisticated labor organization, and they explained this by pointing to the beginning. Humanity was created for labor. The gods organized it this way. The Anunnaki oversaw it. Marduk authorized it. Resisting your place in the system wasn't just social rebellion, it was cosmic disorder. Refusing your labor obligation meant opposing the divine structure that held reality together. This is what made the system so stable. It wasn't just enforced by kings and priests, it was written into the cosmos. The same text that explained creation explained obligation. You exist to serve. The Anunnaki assign the service. Refusing means chaos. Accepting means participating in the cosmic order that began when Marduk slew Tiamat and organised the world from her corpse. The British Museum's fragments preserve this in cuneiform pressed 3 millennia ago. The tablets aren't complete. Sections are damaged. But what remains is clear enough. The Anunnaki as counsel, humanity as solution, labour as purpose, organisation as divine plan. And beneath the Babylonian theology, beneath the propaganda elevating Marduk, the Sumerian pattern persists. Work was happening. Work has failed. New workers were created. Overseers were assigned. The system was organised. The operations continued. What operations? The texts still don't specify. The service of the gods. The work that needed doing. The labour that justified creating an entire species and stationing 600 Anunnaki on Earth to supervise. Whatever it was important enough to structure the cosmos around. Important enough that the oldest creation accounts preserve it as the reason you exist. The council assigned, humanity served. The work continued, and the tablets recorded it as fact, as history, as the beginning but explains the present, as the cosmic structure reflected in every temple, every palace, every administrative complex where human labour was organised, tracked, measured and directed toward purposes decided by those who stood in the Anunnaki's place, speaking with the Anunnaki's authority, maintaining the system that began when Kingu's blood was mixed with clay and humanity was created. To bear the yoke the Igigi refused to carry one day longer.